So, based on the presentations I saw this morning and a lot of the conversations and the questions, it sounds like I'm in the right place, right? Complexity has been a common theme, a word I've heard repeatedly. So I think we're going to talk about complexity in general and how it applies, how it's impacting companies and some of the ways it's impacting companies and some strategies for dealing with it. But we're also going to take a specific look at mergers and acquisitions and how it's impacting the success of mergers and acquisitions. So just what we'll cover, we're going to cover just briefly some current trends in M&A, talk about why we believe that M&A has such a high failure rate, share a story of 3 companies that are really defying these odds, defying the failure rate, and have really succeeded at M&A over a long period of time. And then give you just 3 nuggets that you can take away maybe that'll help you if you're involved in M&A. And I think the nuggets will be equally applicable even in in your company in general. So first off, M&A 2014 is on track and projected to be the most active year for mergers and acquisitions since the recession, right? Lots of money available, beliefs that, capital costs are going to go up, in the near future, lots of targets available. So there's lots of activity, and likely your company is interested in mergers and acquisitions, if not for the sake of the merger and acquisition, but in order to acquire some technology or access to some market that you need. And in fact, surveys say that executives, one of the top intentions for using that excess cash is to do mergers and acquisitions, right? So this is something that's very relevant to, I think, everybody in the room. Of course, the problem is that, they tend to have be pretty risky prospect, right? And it's hard to pin down what is success and failure in a merger and an acquisition, right? So if you're really trying to be scientific about it, it's hard to pin down an exact number. But the overwhelming consensus is this is risky, and people on a general, 50 to 80% of the time are not successful and don't achieve what they wanted to out of it, right? So why is that? Well, if you go to, conventional wisdom, say, why are we not good at mergers and acquisitions? A lot of the writings, a lot of folks will say, well, really it's because we don't do the due diligence right. We assume 1 + 1 is going to equal some number greater than 2. We did some math that said that, and then when it actually happens, it turns out the math was wrong, right? So, maybe it was we overestimated what the top line growth would be, we overestimated how much money we could take out, or we underestimated how many customers would end up leaving, or what the transition costs would be, right? So in other words, the reason that most people cite for our poor performance in mergers and acquisitions is that the folks doing the due diligence, the folks picking the people to acquire, get it wrong, do the analysis wrong, right? And so I just want to challenge that point of view a little bit. If you think about it, mergers and acquisitions have been going on for decades, right? We should be getting better at this. There's schools, have courses dedicated to it. We've got lots of experts. We've got folks who come to conferences like this to learn about it. We should be getting better at analysis. We should be, what has changed that would make us not get that? So despite all the effort and energy we put into getting better at the analysis, we still are seeing this the same rate of failures, right? So we have a different perspective. We believe that the root cause is complexity. Because at the same time, we've been spending all this energy getting better at due diligence and better at analysis and better at identifying companies to acquire, the world's also been getting infinitely more complex, right? So just a little bit of background and history on what I'm talking about. So just going back in time, if you think about the pre-industrial age, how did the world work? Well, it was largely driven by variable costs. One man made one wagon, right? And if he wanted to make 10 wagons, it either took him 10 times as long or he needed 10 people to make the 10 wagons in the same amount of time. Then we had the industrial age, where things were largely driven by fixed costs, right? So now we can invest in an assembly line, we can invest in equipment, and it no longer took 10 people to make 10 times as many things. Maybe I could get it with 3 or 4, right? So fixed costs dominated the world. And we've really moved into a new age that we'll call a post-industrial age, where it's not variable costs or fixed costs that are dominating the environment, but actually it's complexity costs. It's the cost associated with complexity. Because no longer are we trying to make one wagon. We're trying to make one wagon in 10 different colors with different stereo systems and windows and different options and packages and all those things on it, right? And we're also trying to sell it into 10 different markets and all across the globe, and also there's these regulators that have all these rules about how we do that now. And so what is actually driving the costs is that each piece of complexity that we add is impacting the business more and more and more. And so where is this all coming from, right? Well, technology, the technology, the way we make our products is so much more complex than it was even a couple decades ago. Products and services are more complex. The variety of things that customers expect, when they expect them, the processes that we're using to manufacture them or provide those services are also more complex in order to provide that more complex technology. We see organizational complexity, right? Companies, matrix companies, and companies with committees that manage committees, and I mean, who makes the rules? It's hard to follow, right? The markets are more complex. So it's a global world, right? It wasn't that way 20 years ago. And then regulations. Every year the government publishes more and more rules that tell us how to do things, and I don't remember the last time they deleted any. They just keep adding more on top, right? And I'd throw another one on here that I actually don't even on here, but social media and email, right? I mean, the dominant factor that is, it was not 10 years ago. And all these variables work together, right? I mean, you start multiplying these things together, and the impact of each additional one is huge. Because when we think about complexity, complexity is often measured by the number of things, right, is the way we measure it. But the impact is really in the interactions, right? And every new thing that I add can interact a whole bunch more times. When I only have one thing and I add one more thing, well, I only have one interaction. But when I'm down here and I add one more thing, I get a whole bunch more interactions, right? And so that's why we say these costs and the impact of this complexity is geometric, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that the more and more complexity companies take on, the higher and higher these costs of managing this complexity grow. At the same time, the value we get from each incremental unit of complexity is less and less and less, right? Every time I add a new product, I'm likely cannibalizing off a bunch of other products. Every time I add a new committee to help manage some issue, I'm making other parts of the organization less effective at the same time, right? So the value is also diminishing. And so there's not a whole lot of companies that are still down here. I mean, I guess if you're in a startup, likely you're still pretty straightforward, and you may be in that kind of area. Complexity isn't a huge issue for you. More and more companies are here, but a lot of companies that we're beginning to see have crossed that point, that inflection point, where that every new item of complexity that they add just adds more cost than it does value. And so the challenge, and why this is particularly relevant with mergers and acquisitions, is as a company's growing organically, it typically moves and crawls up this line, right? It's kind of like the frog in the pot of boiling water, right? Doesn't realize the water's boiling around it. But when you do a merger and acquisition, you're typically making a big jump, right? You're adding a chunk of complexity. It's not just one or two things. I didn't just add one new product. It's a whole bunch, right? I mean, by definition, the reason we do mergers and acquisition is to add new things, right? We buy it to expand our customers, to get more customers. We do it to get into new geographic markets, to add to our product portfolio or services, and to acquire new technologies. So the very reasons that we're doing mergers and acquisitions are causing us to move further that way. And so that's why we believe that despite the energy and effort spent on getting better at the research, we continue to see same rates of failure. But there's a few companies that have really defied this trend over the years, right? So I'm going to talk about 3 of those. So there's more than these 3 too, but these are just some good examples. So Eaton Corporation, this is a $22 billion company, 103,000 employees. You can see very diverse in a number of different divisions, 175 different companies, and they've done that growth through acquisitions over the years. I mean, that's been their key strategy for growth, right? And so here you say, well, you just pointed out to us that you keep doing all these mergers and acquisitions, you keep adding complexity, it should be impacting your performance, yet they continue to outperform the market over time. Another fantastic example, Danaher, right? $19 billion company, 66,000 employees. Again, they've diversified into a number of different segments. They've acquired over 400 companies since 1984, right? I mean, obviously we just have a few marked there, but 400 companies since 1984. They're beating the market by a ton. So how, where's all this complexity, right? I mean, certainly they're adding a lot of complexity, but they're defying this trend. This is another one. I actually worked for this company for a period of time. So Koch Industries. They are the second largest privately held company in the world, $115 billion in revenue. They are in, I mean, you want to talk about diversity in portfolio, chemicals, refining, consumer goods, ranching, right? They grow cows and they have refineries. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense, right? How can you take on all that much complexity and, still continue to perform? And so they are, I actually work, as I mentioned, I work for them. I worked for them around 2005. I was brought onto Georgia Pacific shortly after Koch Industries acquired Georgia Pacific. So I got to see firsthand how they did that, right? It was a very interesting experience. So not only do they do a lot of acquisitions, in that case, they were a 10,000 person company that acquired a 50,000 person company, right? Not merge. They bought and took them in and said, you are now Koch, right? And here, they're not a publicly traded company, so we had to kind of do some, just based on revenue numbers, what we think projected their stock would be. But since 1960, 4,200 times return for them versus, the S&P 500 30 times. So what is it about these companies? What do they get? I mean, because apparently they're doing something. I mean, these guys, they have actually, and these companies will tell you, like it is their competitive advantage, their ability to continually buy and take on complexity and grow that way, right? So what is it that they get? Well, they get that there's really two kinds of complexity, right? There's value-added complexity and non-value-added complexity. Some complexity is good. Gets me more customers. It gives me more negotiating power with my suppliers or my customers, right? I mean, there's good forms of complexity and there's bad forms of complexity. And so typically when you're taking on a merger and acquisition, I mean, these are just some examples of sources of complexity that you're taking on. And each of them has a value-added component and each of them has a non-value-added component, right? So one of the things these companies are really good at doing is saying, which of the products that I just took on, where's it adding value and where is it not adding value? And the same thing for the technology, geography, channels, etc. But there's two other sources of complexity that these companies pay particular attention to that I think that other companies don't, and really make them stand out and show why they're so good at what they do. And those two sources of complexity are their management system and their culture, all right? And I'll talk a little bit, I'm going to give you a graphic image of what a management system is, and in just a minute we'll talk a little bit more. But just for now, if you're not familiar with that term, a management system is simply the processes that an organization uses to manage its business, right? So not what it does, not the money, not the value chain, but the processes it uses to manage the value chain. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. But what these two companies get is that a management system and culture are always almost always non-value-added complexity, right? There is rarely value added to doing things like performance management different across an organization. There's rarely value in documenting training differently across an organization. Rarely value in managing risk differently across an organization. They get that. And rarely is there value in having different cultures, right? They also understand that these are some of the most difficult things to assess in due diligence. It's easy to figure out what the person you're acquiring's product portfolio is. It's easy to figure out what technology they have, geography. I mean, heck, that's usually what you're talking about, right? What you're not talking about is how do they run their day-to-day business. And that's where, a lot of that non-value-added complexity resides. So therefore, it's typically one of the most commonly ignored factors. And unlike the other sources of complexity, it's also one of the most difficult to remove. Right? Once I decide, hey, these products are not value-added, they're non-value-added complexity, what do? Stop selling them, right? When I find, hey, these geographic locations are not value-added complexity, what do? Sell them. Okay, what do I do with culture? That's a whole, You can't sell the culture. You can't just stop it. You have to change it, right? And so what they're really good at doing is changing those things, changing the way other companies run their business and changing the cultures and the people that they acquire. So the three things that they do. First, they have a single management system across their company. And when they acquire a new company, they make that company take on that management system. It's not an option. It's this is how we know how we run things. We do a pretty good job. We're going to run things the same way here. They have a very clearly and well-defined culture, very clear values and principles, and they actively manage that culture. And when they acquire a new company, they do the same thing to them. They bring them on board and they say, I know those were your values before, but these are your values now, right? And then finally, they take a top-down approach to this integration. Okay, they don't do it from the bottom up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So again, just an illustration of a management system. So everybody, thinks about the end-to-end value chain, right? That's, hey, I acquire some raw materials, convert it to finished goods, I store them, distribute them, collect them, etc. But there's this whole other category of processes that a company has that we refer to collectively as a management system. So the question is, does your company have a management system? Yes. Whether you ever formally talk about it, whether you name it, whether you brand it like some of these other companies we're talking about do, you have one. And many companies don't think about it, right? They just, we kind of do this performance management stuff, and we do this training, but they don't ever think about it as an integrated single system of processes that they work to constantly improve. Then there's another group of companies that do have formal management systems, right? You've probably heard of ISO 9000, ISO 14000, big one in the oil and gas industry, process safety management is imposed upon them by the regulator. In the hospital business, you have responsible care. Lean and Six Sigma are a form of a management system. So you got some group of companies that never even think about this, and so they do these things differently all the way across their company. And then you got other companies who have 2 or 3 or even 4 different, management systems, right? Which is just adding non-value added complexity. So what the companies like we just talked about, Eaton, Danaher, and Coke realize is I don't need to have a whole bunch of different ones. I need to have one. I'm going to have one way we manage business around here. One way we set goals and targets, one way we do planning, one way we define and document our organizational structure, one way we define roles and responsibilities. There's not going to be variation. And when we acquire a new company, they're going to do it the same way we do it. So that if I'm an executive and I go out to a plant or a facility and I say, let me see where your people's roles and responsibilities are documented, it's going to be the same everywhere I go, right? If I say, let me see where you documented your procedures, let me see how you did your training, it's going to be same anywhere they go in the company. All right. Second, just like I said they do with the management system, they do the same thing for culture. And what do I mean by culture? All right, I think this is one of my favorite definitions of culture, a pattern of shared basic assumptions that the group has learned as it solved its problems, that has worked well enough to be considered valid, and is passed on to new members as a correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. So does your company have a culture? Yes, it does. Some companies never think about it. It is what it is, right? Some companies, do this. They put some values on the wall, and do step 2, and then it's done, right? They have a culture. These companies don't do that. They recognize that, yes, the first step is defining those values and the behaviors, but they take that all the way down to the individual level and say, do you understand what that value means in your work, right? They integrate that into their performance management processes. They integrate it into their training. They integrate it into the way they even investigate incidents and trace the root causes back to cultural issues, right? It's just relentless, the way that they manage those two things. And so what really sets these 3 companies apart and their ability to continue to take on all this complexity is that those 2 things they don't have that non-value added complexity from those, right? All 3 of these companies have an extremely well-developed, very mature management system and very well-defined culture that they actively manage and improve. And all 3 of these companies, if you ask them what is your number 1 competitive advantage, they'll tell you it's our management system and our culture. Right? They're standardized. And when we bring a new company into the fold, it's not an option. You're gonna do it this way. And I mean, not to sound harsh, as I mentioned, I worked for Koch Industries when they acquired, I worked for Georgia Pacific when they acquired Koch Industries. And I remember there was an SVP over the wood products business this is about a 20,000 person business, so larger than Koch Industries was, who was acquiring him, right? And he made all the plant managers have a conference call every morning at 7 a.m. Christmas, Easter, didn't matter, every 7 a.m. they had to have a conference call with him. On the day of the acquisition, he said, you don't worry, we built this company together. We built Georgia Pacific, nothing's going to change. We're going to keep doing things the way we've always done them, nothing's going to change. That afternoon, his resignation was announced, right? Because he didn't get it, right? We're not going to do things different. We're going to do things the same way. So, the second thing is the way that they implement these management systems and culture. So, many times, I mean, I hear more and more when companies, particularly consulting companies, talking about how they help companies with mergers and acquisitions. I hear a very bottoms-up approach, right? Very bottoms-up. So what are we going to do? Well, we acquired this company. We're going to get about 100 consultants, which is going to cost a lot of money. And we're going to lock them in a room with about 200 of your employees. And we're going to take every procedure level detail and we're going to map them all out. And we're going to figure out the best ways to do them. And then we're going to redo all your ERP software. And then boom, we're going to turn lights on and you're one company, right? And that's kind of the strategy. I call that bottoms up. And my experience has been that does not work very often. It doesn't work. One, it's incredibly expensive. Two, it puts so much change on the organization at one time that it usually rejects it, right? And then three, by the time you actually get to the point where you're seeing the results, right, people are like, hey, this has been too long. We're 2 years down the road and I'm not seeing any results yet. What these companies do that do it well is they take a very top-down approach. They don't start at, hey, I'm going to get the ERP system all 100% perfect. They start with those management system processes, right? So we're going to train everybody the same way first. We're going to document our roles and responsibilities the same way first. We're going to do goals and targets the same way first, right? And then once they get down that level, then they start doing some of the, hey, we're going to standardize our policies. Our HR policies, our hiring policies, those kind of things across the company. And then they work their way down to the procedures. And what that does for them is rather than taking what I call an instantaneous perfection approach, they take a continuous improvement approach, right? They continually adapt, and as they learn new things, they improve the way that they're integrating the two companies. It takes a lot fewer resources. You can do the change in small chunks instead of one giant, nuclear bomb of change. And then you begin to see the benefits right away. I mean, that was very much the experience I had at Georgia Pacific when being acquired by Koch. And then I got to be part of a couple, we acquired plants and brought them into the fold. Very much my experience was that they got a lot more progress taking this top-down approach. So we do a lot of, as I mentioned, we do a lot of work with companies that face complexity. And so we've seen this in our own practice too. One of our clients is a large integrated oil company, and they are the product of a merger about 5 years ago of two other very large oil and gas companies. One of them a very entrepreneurial company, one of them a former government company, right? So two dramatically different cultures, right? You're taking the entrepreneur and the bureaucrat and putting them together in the same room. And so, what they do, well, they did recognize, hey, they needed to standardize their management system, but, rather than saying, hey, this is what it is and working from the top down, it was this kind of merger blend and nobody was really sure who owned anything or what. And, we really worked with them to simplify that and say, hey, you need to assign clear owners for these management system processes. You need to say we're going to do training one way, not try and do it 3 different ways. They talked about cultural change, but in broad generalities. So they said, we need to become more operationally disciplined. And then they waited for everybody to become more operationally disciplined, right? And people were saying, well, what does that mean? I don't understand, And pretty soon everybody in the company is using the word operational discipline to get whatever they want done, right? You're late to the meeting. That's not operationally disciplined. Well, we're having a meeting and you're not prepared. That's not operational, you know what I mean? It's like everything was operational. So we worked with them to define what does that really mean, and let's build a strategy and a way to engage all the way down to the shop floor to standardize that culture based on the principles of a high reliability organization. And then finally, they were taking a very bottoms-up approach. They were spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million a year in consultants, and they had been doing that for 3 years in an attempt to standardize this stuff, and they had made zero headway, right? I mean, they basically had a spreadsheet with 4,300 line items on it of things they needed to fix. And so we advocated for, let's take a step back, let's take the top-down approach, and in the 2-year period, dramatically reduce the cost to implement to 90%, and have seen actual progress coming from it. So just a few key takeaways. So M&A is likely to be a component of your company's strategy, right? If it wasn't this year, I would anticipate in the next few years it will before the current windows close. These M&As have a high failure rate, and we don't think it's because folks like you don't do good analysis. We think it's because this complexity problem, right? So if you're part of one and it fails, use that excuse. You can reference this presentation and say, it's not me, it was the complexity, right? To be successful, you have to take on the value-added complexity while eliminating the non-value-added complexity. And the most successful companies recognize that there's those 3 sources, or 2 sources that they need to avoid at all costs, and that comes from their management system and their culture, and they need to do it with a top-down approach, because ultimately that bottoms-up approach is just more complexity, right? I just invited in 100 consultants, and they just brought a whole lot more complexity with them. So that was all I have. Any questions? Comments? Rude social remarks?
Any questions for Chris at all?
How does the M&A strategy you covered those companies contrast with like the Berkshire Hathaway approach?
Well, they don't usually take they take a controlling interest in ownership, but not in management, right? They stay relatively disengaged, put somebody on the board of directors. So, I mean, you could almost look at them like a share. I mean, they're kind of like us, right? I mean, we got stock in some companies. We don't have enough to influence the board of directors, but they don't take a specific interest. I mean, I'll speak heavily to Koch because that's my personal experience. But Charles Koch is seen in all his companies, right? I mean, he goes and visits and audits, make sure that things are being done the way that he would expect them to be done. And the expectations are similar at a Danaher and Eaton that. There's certain processes that their leadership expects to see, and they're going to go see them. So, I think the other one, they're just accepting the risk, and they're not really trying to get the synergies right out of the acquisition.
Thank you. It was awesome.
Thank you.
And it's kind of a diagnostic, right, of problems and success factors. If you look at large legacy companies like Fortune 100s, Fortune 500s. Presumably, they face very similar complexity challenges without, you could just take M&A out of the equation.
Absolutely,
they face absolutely the same cultural challenges. Have you ever applied this diagnostic or any of these methodologies and approaches in the context of just like a big-ass corporation that's a mess?
Yeah, so we do. I mean, I personally right now I'm working with 3 different companies that are all large companies that are in some phase of implementing a management system and trying to change their culture. One of those, product of a merger. One is a relatively, it's about a 12,000 person company, but it's only probably about 10 years old. And then another one's a 100-year-old company, right, that has 4 different management systems, right? And it's drowning. I mean, that's what their people literally, when they called us, they said, like, we are drowning in administrative junk. Right, and we do paperwork all day, and it doesn't create any value. So we need to get rid of that complexity. So absolutely, I think I want to talk about it in the sense of mergers and acquisitions because I think that's a very critical. Right, you're adding a big chunk of complexity right at once. But the others, it's the frog in a pot of boiling water for a lot of big companies. Right, the complexity just got up around them, and they didn't realize when they crossed through that point, and now they're there and don't know what to do about it. But you can absolutely take out huge chunks of cost and improve performance taking that approach. So,
one more question.
Hi. See, as you have suggested, one of the successful rules of M&A would be to avoid non-value added complexity, which could be a culture of the company which you're acquiring, right? Will it not result in kind of losing the talents or specifically the human resource talent or creating attrition just because there is going to be a change in the culture post its acquisition?
Yeah, so, and I'll tell you something that Coke learned from the acquisition of GP wasn't perfect for them. One of the things they said was they dramatically underestimated how much harder it would be to take on a company 5 times their size. That was the only time in their history they've ever tried to do that. Because in the past, they didn't have to go just, get rid of this guy and lose the talent. You said they were able to surround, come in as leaders and stand by the leaders and say, this is how we do things here, right? And I'm going to teach you and mentor you and bring you along and help you. So that's certainly a risk. But I'll say all 3 of these companies as well, part of their due diligence that is different is they focus on the management system and the culture the company already has, right? Because they're trained and they get it and they look at it and they understand. So they send their operations folks in and say, how bad is this culture and how hard is it going to be to change it, right? How different is this management system? And we want it to be different in the sense that, ours is better and it's going to make them run better. But we don't want it to be so strong that they're going to fight us and, reject us, right? So that's another way they offset that. So.
I look at sample orders and I see the need for change agents within an organization, right? Guys who control it and seed the change.
Absolutely, yeah.
And do you see things like Lean Six Sigma, you have a talent system? Do you see that kind of approach being applied here?
Lean Six Sigma, and one of our beliefs about Lean Six Sigma and why it actually hasn't seen the results that people have, expected, right? I mean, if you go do this, there's a lot of people disappointed in Lean Six Sigma. Lean Six Sigma is another very bottoms-up management process, right? We're going to go have a whole bunch of little projects, and 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 is going to add up to 40, but for some reason it only adds up to 2, and we can't figure out why, right? And so really, this is more of a top-down approach. It really has to start with senior leadership saying, we're going to define a management system and we're going to use it. More similar to like an ISO type implementation would be. So I think we're on well over time.
You're
though,
right.
so.
These guys, I say these guys, Wilson Perumal, they have a stand in the main room.